Okay, this is where I do the idle chit-chat thing. But seeing as I got nobody to chit-chat with tonight, we're going to just start the show. Knowing Peasant Radio Show. Here we go.
Get ready to free your minds, advance freedom, and better all of society with the Annoying Peasants.
And now for something completely different.
Humans do have an amazing capacity for believing what they choose. I think before we go around killing people, we had better make dance here of our evidence.
They lied to you. It's time to learn the truth.
You can't handle the truth!
From what was once an inarticulate mass of lifeless tissues, may I now present a cultured, sophisticated man about town.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of the Annoying Peasant Radio Show. This is where Brad usually says, my name is Brad, and I'm joined tonight by Tom, but that's not the case. I'm just Tom, doing it alone. Anyway, appreciate you joining me. Hang on one sec. All right, sorry about that. We're talking tonight, well, we're continuing the show that we did last week, which was Anne Frank and Snowden. How can those two names be in the same sentence? Part 2. So thanks for joining us for this episode. I hope to keep you as interested as I possibly can. Doing a one-man band, I guess. Yeah, I wanted to bring up a couple things. Usually I kind of do a brief overview of the show and what we talk about. I think I'm abandoning that a little bit tonight just to try something a little different. You know, tonight's show, really, we are going to explore a number of moral questions and circumstances. You know, essentially some moral conundrums. And what do you do? You may be a little upset for me to be able to tell you I can't answer that question. I would say only each individual, in fact, can. But we speak of morality on the show often, right? And many times I've quoted the words of abolitionist, nonconformist, radical Lysander Spooner. I just love his stuff. He was trained as a lawyer, and he has a certain writing style I find unique. Anyway, you know, kind of in this vein of Lysander Spooner, what is it that one is to rightfully do when the state requires you to do something that you believe is immoral, right? I'm trying to think. The Fugitive Slave Act required one to report and not provide any assistance or aid to a runaway slave. Would you do that? Do you find it moral to comply with the law? And that's really the question. What do you do when you find the law immoral? So Henry David Thoreau questioned the form of obedience. You know, many people claim that you need to obey the law out of obedience, right? Others have, you know, I don't know, other than obedience, you could say civic duty. Some, I think it springs from their religious beliefs. I don't know, others maybe just out of tradition. I don't know all the possibilities for why people obediently align themselves with the state. But Thoreau questioned the form of obedience that sprang from a genuine respect for the authority of the state. You know, even I have, and Thoreau also had this, you know, the law is what he's been told and should be respected regardless of content. But think about this, and this is, you know, Thoreau's thoughts. Through such attitudes, otherwise good men become agents of injustice, do they not? Think about that in a little bit more depth. If the law is the law, and should be respected regardless of a content. When it's immoral, when it's immoral and men choose to obey it and carry out those actions or orders, do good men then become agents of injustice? That's one of the many questions we'll have for the evening. Thoreau went on to point out that not all laws are equal in their purpose. Some laws are intended to solely protect the state. For example, laws against tax evasion, treason, contempt of court. And they often have more severe penalties associated with them than those that protect individuals. So that led Thoreau to think or to ponder, about the psychology of men who would fight a war and perhaps kill a stranger who had done him no personal harm. Of course, instead of personal harm, I would say violated property rights, but Thoreau wasn't in the same place. But think about this for a second. Even so, he's talking about a man who would fight a war and kill a stranger who had done him no personal harm. This adversary may have been present due to the same circumstances or similar circumstances, right? I don't know, maybe he'd been drafted. Maybe they volunteered, each of these people, into their armies or their military arm that they chose, and they didn't foresee or believe that they would be in such a situation, and here they find themselves in that situation. So Thoreau asked, would men kill out of obedience to the state, even if he thought the actions of the state immoral? Thoreau characterized men who would act in such a way as somewhat less than human. In acting this way, Thoreau described such men as not as men mainly, but as machine with their bodies. In doing so, the men relinquished the free exercise of their moral sense, and so put themselves on a level with wood, earth, and stones. And my question is this utilitarianism? Essentially using men as means to an end? I think that's something we should all think about in depth. Put yourself in this circumstance, and I'll get to kind of recapping what we talked about last week, but, we obviously one of the things we talked about was Anne Frank. But when reading the diary of Anne Frank, most support that her family's evasion of the Nazis, right, was justified. But on what grounds was she actually justified? Why were her family's actions justified? She was, in fact, considered by the government at the time to be a criminal, right? She was evading them. And then, similar to my example of the Fugitive Slave Act, would you have turned her in as the law required at the time? But now let's go one step further. If you thought it wrong or immoral to report the fact of the Frank family's hiding, you would be engaged in civil disobedience and therefore a lawbreaker or a criminal, right? But how far does civil disobedience go for you? This puts you in a bit of a slippery slope or a continuum problem, as I think many philosophers like to describe. In your case, if you were drafted into a war that you did not support, would you in fact go? Would you engage in a battle? Would you essentially kill for the state? I know they may seem to be easy questions, but think about if you were in that situation. Doesn't it get more difficult? There are now a huge number of questions that arise out of this type of thinking, right? Consider drone strikes for the moment, which I'd argue that many people don't even consider them at all. But for the moment, and I'm not going to go too deep into drone strikes, but, first of all, are they justified or even justifiable, right? Without going, again, too deep in that question, if you think that drone strikes are unjustified, there's no mechanism currently in place for you to withdraw your support for this activity, right? How do you pay your taxes and then, take a deduction for the cost of the drone program for the cost of drone strikes, or however you want to characterize that? But look at the position this puts you in. Since you, as a practical matter, can't do that, you are, in fact, supporting an injustice, right? Again, the state essentially requires you to support them in what they're doing, and if it's unjust, Isn't it immoral to do so? I'm asking the questions. Let's move on to Snowden, which is, again, another thing we talked about, or in part, last time. If you were in his shoes and you were convinced that the government was unjustly spying on innocents, would you become a whistleblower? And if you would, how would you go about it? How would you do it? I know I've heard the argument, people say, well, he should have gone through the chain of command there, right? In other words, reported to his boss, blah, 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 go through all that. Well, we've seen what happens, and every man has to make a judgment on how he's going to do that. We're going to talk a little more about James Clapper, but I'm going to argue that the government was not likely to reveal that they're spying on all of us on their own accord, right? I'm just going to allude to a little, I think I even have, I'm going to do an audio clip here, but okay, back in 2013, I believe it was June 2013, so darn near 2 years exactly ago, there was an article published, Fire James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence lied to Congress about NSA surveillance. What else will he lie about? That was written by Fred Kaplan. I believe it was I found it on slate.com. You probably find it a couple other places. But this, maybe some of you are aware of or heard of or saw this. Back at an open congressional hearing on March 12th, Senator Ron Wyden, he was a Democrat from Oregon, he asked Clapper, does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans? Clapper replied, no, sir, not wittingly. And since I don't want you to take my word for it here, I'm going to play you an audio clip. Just a second here to support that claim. All right, here we go. Senator Wyden questioning James Clapper about spying.
Last summer, the NSA director was at a conference, and he was asked a question about the NSA surveillance of Americans. He replied, and I quote here, "The story that we have millions or hundreds of millions of dossiers on people is completely false." The reason I'm asking the question is, having served on the committee now for a dozen years, I don't really know what a dossier is in this context. So what I wanted to see is if you could give me a yes or no answer to the question, does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly. There are cases where they could inadvertently, perhaps, collect, but not wittingly.
Okay, there you have his denial that was not the case. And I know a number of you are going to say, well, wait a minute. He was engaged in a secret program and he couldn't reveal it. Okay, that may be fine, and that may be the terms, but I want to go just a little bit deeper with this before we get to part two of our discussion here on the surveillance state. This is still, I'm going with this article that I alluded to. That was the Fred Kaplan article from 2 years ago. And now let me just read some of it. He says, as we all know, he was lying. Speaking about Clapper, of course. We also now know that Clapper knew he was lying. Okay, so in other words, he's showing that Clapper didn't do this accidentally. In an interview with NBC's Andrea Mitchell that aired this past Sunday, so again, this was about 2 years ago, Clapper was asked why he answered Wyden the way he did. And here's his reply. This is a quote. I thought, though in retrospect, I was asked, when are you going to stop beating your wife kind of question, which is not answerable necessarily by a simple yes or no. So I responded in what I thought was the most truthful or least untruthful manner by saying no. And I just find this interesting. The quote is, I thought, though in retrospect. So I'm not even sure what he's saying. when he says, I thought, I'm assuming he's alluded to at the time he was asked the question. But now he's saying, though, in retrospect. So I'm not entirely sure what his answer actually is. And I also find it interesting that he didn't say he was sworn to secrecy, so he couldn't answer that question. And again, I don't know if there's some kind of legal maneuvering to get out of this. But here's also one interesting thing, the way he answered that question. Clapper was supplied those questions the day before the hearing. So this question was obviously not a surprise. It wasn't like, oh boy, I'm really not sure here. Maybe he was sworn to secrecy and he has to go, oh geez, I don't know how to answer this question now. Again, being supplied these questions the day before, you think he would have been able to come up with something a little better. And again, the show is not about, well, he isn't a good answerer of questions. The show is about the situation we're in, and basically, do your liberties exist or do they not? Should you be free? Should you not? So is Snowden in fact a traitor? You know, of the charges against Snowden, treason is among them. But think about that for a minute. Treason is defined as giving comfort and or aid to enemies of the government, and that's just my loose definition I gave. I didn't look up the actual definition of treason, but basically that's it, right? But so what did Snowden do? He provided information, right, regarding the mass collection of data, spying, if you will, on the American public. But if treason is defined as giving comfort, essentially aid to the enemies of the state, of the government, he provided this information to the public. So is the public the enemy of the government then? Wouldn't you have to be if you were guilty of treason? Now, I understand that he revealed information, and that anyone could hear it and understand that, okay, this is what's happening. So I get my detractors will say, well, he revealed it to everyone, so even enemies of the state could have access to that information. And in fact, I'm sure they do. Anyone has access to it. But I think this raises a number of interesting questions, and that's my point. Right? And now put yourself in another question. So let's assume this goes to trial. Snowden comes back. He goes to trial. Again, this is just all a giant assumption. Maybe this will never come to pass. If you're a juror, would you convict Snowden of treason? Right? Would you have convicted those that illegally, in quotes, aided slaves who ran away to seek freedom in the North, as was the law under the Fugitive Slave Act? Would you have turned in Anne Frank? Right? The law is the law, remember? I'm just, where we're really ultimately going with this, or where I think you have to go is, a strategy for retaining or regaining lost liberties would be civil disobedience. When I speak of civil disobedience, I specifically intend on peaceful resistance, right? Don't confuse with what I'm putting forth here and what many times we talk about on the show. We're not Molotov cocktail throwers. We're not, vandalizers. Those would be violations of property rights, right? That would be inherently antithetical to what we support on this show, right? The bottom line is we support justice rooted in natural law, peaceful coexistence, and prosperity. I think a lot of people agree with that. The question is, how is this done? I think for a lot of people, and I think that's, I've given it to Brad and others on the show, so you're actually asking the wrong question. The question really is the moral question, and, it could argue that it essentially comes down to property rights. Is it okay to violate someone's property rights? And if it is, what do property rights really mean? We've talked about them many times on this show about property rights rooted in self-ownership and all that stuff. I'm not going to get into that tonight, but I just wanted to put forward, a lot of these questions for you to really think about. And I think I would argue most people don't ever even contemplate them. And even if they do so superficially. And I would encourage people to do some reading and do some severe thinking. And actually, I find conversation is very helpful. It's a lot faster moving. Yes, it's typically not as in depth, but it raises a number of questions in one's minds, and then it maybe inspires you to go do that reading to really get to the bottom of it. But justice, peaceful coexistence, prosperity, that's essentially the entire content of this show. Basically, there's nothing else to this show. And as Brad likes to say, we aim to make you think. And we aim on this episode to think about the questions I've asked and, of course, much more. We'll usually do a quote of the day and a number of things, but I'll just repeat one from last week because I thought it was very appropriate for the topic or the feature story. That was from Mohandas Gandhi. He says, any man who subordinates his will to that of the state surrenders his liberty and thus becomes a slave. I think it's a good quote, and again, something to really think about. Under the short announcements that I have for tonight, and again, I intended to keep it short, AgoraFest 2015 at the Villa Maria Conference Center and Retreat. That's September 24th to the 27th. Save the date on Much Ado. We will be there live broadcasting, and it's always a good time. Check out the Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AnnoyingPeasantRadio for a variety of postings. There's, I think, some very interesting stuff on there that Tanya, Tim, Cassie, and myself, we put stuff on there, and I thank Tanya, Tim, and Cassie for their efforts. They do a great job. Sometimes there's stuff that just makes me laugh, and if you're interested in having a laugh once in a while, go to that Facebook page. Our next live show will be obviously next Tuesday evening, June 23rd at 7 p.m. Central. We may be continuing with part 3 of tonight's show topic if we finish up, which I'm not entirely sure we will. But if we do finish up, obviously we'll have a new topic for you. Next week, I believe, is the last week of the month, or last Tuesday of the month that shows up. That may not be right. I think we have the 30th. I think I'm the 23rd, and then there's the 30th. So we'll pick a new topic for next week, and then I believe Tanya will be with us the week thereafter. Northwood's mom. We always look forward to that. Before I get started, I guess I have to issue the reminder. You are listening to the Annoying Peasant Radio Show, and thanks so much for joining us. And here we go. We were discussing You're a Criminal in a Mass Surveillance World, How Not to Get Caught by David Montgomery. That was written May 31st of this year, 2015. I just want to do, I guess as quickly as I can, a bit of a recap of what we talked about. Again, a little consistent with what we just discussed. I asked a number of questions to our listeners. Many of them I covered in the opening in tonight's show. Maybe the largest question is simply, is it moral to support laws that are in fact immoral? If the answer is yes, what then of the soldiers who were engaged in unjust war? So if you need to follow laws, no matter if they're moral or immoral, how can you hold soldiers responsible for any of their actions, right? They're clearly just following orders. How could you hold responsible any agent of the state for anything they do immoral? In other words, if the state orders someone to do something immoral, you have, therefore, by that logic, no responsibility for any immoral acts that agent engages in, right? Is that a green light to just be immoral? I really hope that people would think about that. I have I wanted to get to something here. Here we go. A quote from another article. Let me get back. I got to tell you which article exactly it is. It's this article was, let's see, it's entitled, I think, Let Us Salute the Flag Let Us Salute the Flag, and the subtitle is On the Nobility of Motives by Fred Reed. That was June 15th. I think I found this originally on LouRockwell.com. You likely can find it other places. But again, this obviously out of context, because I'm just going to quote about a paragraph or paragraph and a half. And this is where the author's talking about the morality of soldiers, essentially. I know this is a very sticky issue for Brad, especially, and I know for the vast majority of people, and I guess maybe because it's sticky is why I keep coming back to it readily. But again, quote from this article. A Marine colonel will be at home a good neighbor, civic-minded, honest, cut the grass, and help old ladies across the street. Come a war, and he will mercilessly bomb any city he is told to bomb. And after killing, he doesn't care whom on the ground. He will go to the officers' club where there will be high fives and war stories. Okay, just a couple more lines. We must not notice this, or the other feral dogs will turn on us. If you say that soldiers are morally indistinguishable from mafia hitmen, you will arouse outrage. But there is no difference. A soldier who has never heard of Vietnam or Iraq goes when ordered to kill Vietnamese and Iraqis and duly kills them. Guido and Vito, who have never heard of Hyman Blitzheim, in the store owner who is behind on his protection payments, break Hyman's leg when ordered to do. What's the difference, the author asks. Right? And I know some people are going to say, well, it was a democratic system that put the guys in power who made the orders. Well, if the orders are immoral, I think it's a very valid question. What's the difference? Again, that was from Let Us Salute the Flag by Fred Reed, June 15th of 2015. So again, I'm a little out of context there because I should be recapping. Get back to what we did in part one, or what we discussed in part one. We took a look at law, criminality, and mass surveillance. Those are actually very interesting things. Again, I think most people don't think about that, but very interesting. Most people, well, why would we even take a look at law? I mean, it's basically just what it is, what it says. I think there's much more to that, and if you have interest, obviously go back and listen to last week's show. We discussed some background on Anne Frank. Just think for a moment. Imagine what Anne Frank witnessed in her short, sightless life. Imagine the horrors. We discussed what makes a criminal. We considered crime, law, and the notion of criminal, right? That's related to what we just talked about, but criminality. Anne Frank was in fact a criminal. She was a fugitive of the law. She was evading the law. I think I would argue most people who read the Diary of Anne Frank, when I say read, I was required to read it, and I don't remember if that was junior high or high school. Suffice it to say, it was quite a number of years ago in school. Obviously, I wasn't Mr. Student, and I wasn't particularly interested in that at the time. Certainly should have been, but I wasn't. But think about that. You know, I think people were very on the side, very much so on the side, or sympathetic to Anne Frank. But it's hard for them to come to the realization that she was, in fact, a criminal based on the laws of the time. An interesting thing that we talked about last week, basically that the law is largely incomprehensible to the governed, but ignorance of the law is not a defense, right? Think about that. People, what was the Obamacare Act? The number of pages that many of the senators, and I assume many of the representatives, never actually read the law before even voting on it. Why? Because in part it was so lengthy and probably so convoluted that you, as a practical matter, you can't read it. Now, this is a bad example for the comprehension of common citizen in the law, because obviously I don't have to know everything that's in there. But the number of laws that are passed every year, and that they're written, in fact, in legalese, right? You can't comprehend them. But it's not a defense to be ignorant of them. You're supposed to know what's in them. Well, how could you possibly know them? We talked about the inconsistency in the application of the law. We talked about how sentences are just completely out of whack, and that many times violating laws that are essentially there is designed to protect the state, say tax evasion, right? Those are much more, the penalties for those are much more severe than violating someone else's property right. I've often said, violate a rule, an ordinance, a law of the state, which I'd argue that the word law is a misapplication of that word, but that's another show. That's severe. Steal somebody's chickens, apparently, call them, the cops don't have time for that. They're really busy. One of the points that was made last week is that the system is largely rigged against you, and your chance of conviction at trial is about 90%. Now, hang on, that doesn't mean 90% of all cases, right? Because most of them are plea bargained away. That's the point. And the risk is very high, so most people attempt to avoid trial, which seems a little crazy, right? Because the whole idea is the trial is your fair shot at justice, but most people avoid it. Why? Because it's a rigged game. But many people, again, defend the state and the criminal justice system that we have. And I think a very important thing that we talked about, it's this whole thing with Snowden and surveillance. If you have nothing to hide, right? Otto Frank, who was, of course, Anne Frank's father, his disclosure a decade earlier of a single piece of data, the family's religion, destroyed the family. Now, the disclosure was a legal requirement in order to be issued a passport. So we went on to talk about, to apologists of mass surveillance. What did Anne Frank have to hide? Right? You have nothing to fear. If you have nothing to hide is kind of like the common slogan there. Well, she didn't have anything to hide, right? And she didn't, Otto Frank disclosed that one piece of information that really ended her. Think about the information in that context extracted by the U.S. Census and annual American Community Survey, right? And to be honest, I don't know how many questions. There's a lot of questions on there, whatever the specific number is. It's crazy. So when you feel like, I have nothing to hide, so you have nothing to fear, I got a feeling Anne Frank or Otto Frank had the same attitude. Didn't work for him. And I know people always tell me, hey, these are different times. It just can't happen here. I wonder how many times that was said right before it happened. So now we're going to go right back. I was kind of going right through the article that we're talking about. And let me get the exact title for you again. I will repost it on the Facebook page just so it's fresh up there. It's You're a Criminal in a Mass Surveillance World, How Not to Get Caught. That's a part of this article that we're not going to go over. But it was written by David, the How Not to Get Caught part. But it was written by David Montgomery. I believe it was released or written on May 31st of this year, 2015. So I'm just going to pick up where we left off. We kind of got into that, the census thing and the collection of information. This section in the original article was entitled Collect It All. And he talks about Minister Goebbels, who would have wrung his hands with delight at having this depth of data on his regime's citizens. By this data, we're talking about the data, obviously, that was collected under the mass surveillance program. But this data is absolutely trivial compared to what the U.S. government actually knows about you. Thanks to William Binney and Edward Snowden, we know that the U.S. regime has for many years been secretly constructing the means to monitor and record every aspect of our lives. Snowden put it in terms everyone can understand. Even if you aren't doing anything wrong, you are being watched and recorded. Think about that. And I know there are many deniers that that's not happening. I think Snowden should have put that to rest in the information that he brought forward. But that's obviously for every person to contemplate on their own. Thankfully, we don't have to take Snowden's word for it. The government's agenda was laid bare in this secret NSA slide from 2011. It was called sniff it all, know it all, collect it all, process it all, exploit it all. Share it all is a reference to swapping surveillance data with New Zealand, by the way, Canada, Britain, and Australia. I guess they're the so-called Five Eyes for the United States. Think about that. It's unbelievable. I've read more on this topic recently, and I'll hopefully remember to share a little bit with you later. But the next section is turnkey tyranny. Snowden nailed the collect it all endgame in a single phrase: turnkey tyranny. As is the case with most propaganda, the NSA reveals its intentions in a cloak of misdirections. The cloak here is security. National security isn't about your own personal security, as comforting as it would be to believe. And I think almost everybody believes that the idea of national security is about your security. It's about the security of the government, no matter what the government is today or becomes in the future. You know, that's a change in perspective that you have, I think, when you go through, I think Dr. Reed, Leonard Reed, called it, or he quoted one of his students who called it enlightenment, and I think he adopted that term because he liked it. But once you've gone through this and you've come to believe or understand the state, as Murray Rothbard put it, is just simply a criminal gang of thieves. You see things so differently. And that national security is, in fact, about the security of the government, no matter what the government is today or becomes in the future. It's not about your personal security. And I think a lot of people feel that, well, we have to have this giant military because my security and safety is at risk. And trust me, yours is still at risk. The government's is the one that's not at risk when you have a giant military. In fact, every time the author says, every time you see or hear the word national, just think government, right? When politicians beat the national security drum, they're really referring to regime security, not your security, right? The NSA is, in essence, the government security agency. The national anthem is the government anthem. When you pledge allegiance to the flag, you're vowing to serve the government, not family, friends, neighbors, or customers. Just recently, well, a meme was going around from Lou Rockwell, and he was saying, you know, I can't remember what the meme exactly was, but something like pledge allegiance to your family, your friends, right? The people that matter to you. Don't pledge allegiance to a government. Understanding the motives helps us see every justification of mass surveillance for what it really is, a veiled threat. If they don't do it, terrorists will kill you, right? So you go, oh, my goodness. Well, then they better spy on me. Terrorism, the mortal danger to civilization which kills fewer people than asphyxiation, bathtub falls, toddlers, and lightning, right? Those are just some crazy examples that the author listed in that article. Right? I think most people are very freaked out about terrorists, but I would argue your insecurity is ill-founded, right? You need to put this in proper context, I guess, or the risk in proper context. The next section was entitled "A Noose Around All Our Necks." Mass surveillance equals perpetual uncertainty. No matter how honest and benevolent you consider the current American government, no one knows what laws a future regime will impose. Right? You say, again, it can't happen here, right? I've heard that, right? Otto Frank never would have disclosed his family's religion had he known it would lead to the murder of his loved ones a decade later. His family would have fled Germany and attempted to illegally immigrate elsewhere. He would have, but as millions have done throughout history. Living under mass surveillance is living with a noose around your neck. You can't know what circumstances will cause you to hang. History is loaded with never saw that coming catastrophes. Again, it can't happen here. The 20th century alone is an inconceivable horror. 262 million corpses engulfed in various government wars and genocides. That's equivalent to every single adult living in America today suddenly perishing. And I know people say, well, it's not 262, it's 340, 350, something, whatever. The number's close enough for my purposes. All the nightmare regimes of the past that kids study in school predate the era of computerized mass surveillance. The ability to lock down people's lives instantly, to track them, analyze them, trap them, financially paralyze them, impersonate them, frame them, and apprehend them is unprecedented. Governments always seek to control the governed, but mass surveillance is the most powerful weapon of control ever devised. Because of its novelty, invisibility, and deep complexity, many people can't comprehend its implications and therefore don't defend against it. That's, again, one of the many things I would advocate here. Understand what is going on. Think about it, right? It's craziness what is happening, but most people are undeterred. The next section that was in there, why you're a criminal, right? People say, well, I'm not a criminal, so I'm not worried about any of this stuff. We talked a little bit about that book, 3 Felonies a Day, last time, I think, before we got into things. He says in this section, again, why you're a criminal. We unknowingly commit crimes, including felonies, in our day-to-day lives. The fact that we haven't been caught is a matter of detection, namely surveillance. As mass surveillance expands, the government's crime detection capabilities increase exponentially. Think about it. You can look at the past and say, well, okay, wait a minute. If this is such this crazy mass surveillance state and all this stuff and all this is going on, well, I'm not getting busted for stuff that, that maybe I do, that I don't even know is illegal, but may be illegal, right? Wait till this fully kicks in. The capacity here is incredible. The author says there is no one in the United States over the age of 18 who cannot be indicted for some federal crime. And he says that's not an exaggeration. The warning is from John Baker, a retired law professor who tried in vain to count new federal crimes created in just the past few years. The same message comes from attorney Harvey Silvergate in his book, 3 Felonies a Day, How the Feds Target the Innocent. That's obviously the book I was talking about. Because politicians have made us criminals. And think about that, this beginning of this sentence. Politicians have made us criminals. Last week we talked about criminality, right? What's a crime? It's breaking of the law. What's a law? It's whatever the government essentially writes down and calls a law. So you can make a voluntary exchange where one guy wants to sell something, the other guy wants to buy something. You can make that a crime. You write a law to make it illegal, right? That all of a sudden he's now a criminal, right? So because politicians have made us criminals, what the government knows about you can cost you your freedom. Understanding that is so important that you shouldn't take anybody's word for it. See for yourself. And now he goes a little deeper into all the laws. Into the abyss is the next section. Most federal laws aggregated into the United States Code, or I believe it's USC, not University of Southern California, and the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR. But he says, let's start with the CFR. Select, he goes on this whole thing about how hard it is to read. Some of the titles or topics essentially have several volumes for each one. He talks about volume 1 of the 2014 Banks and Banking Code, the first of 10 volumes for that year alone. Right? He says, if you're anything like me, after a few minutes, your brain will attempt to revolt. Push on and do your best. He's talking about reading in these volumes. Push on and do your best to even vaguely understand what Congress, the lawmakers, demand of Americans. You're up against literally hundreds of thousands of pages of legalese. Much may not apply to anything you're currently doing in your life, but finding out what applies to you now and has applied to you in the past is quite literally impossible. Right? Is that just? Right? Think about that. And thousands of new rules being created every year, you won't know when you break new laws in the future either. Think about it. So the point is you can't possibly comply. That's the problem, right? He says, need a breather? Have a laugh with me at the sinister humor of the CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, website slogan, keeping America informed. That's their slogan. It has to be the antithesis of this. How many Americans have ever even heard of the CFR, much less read a single sentence of its laws? Actually, I have, but that's something else. What could possibly better illustrate the essence of propaganda double talk than this slogan? When you tap out on the CFR, then give the USC a browse. But wait, there's more. Thousands of pages more. The IRS code is over 7,500 pages and 3.4 million words. When the IRS decides you've done something wrong, you are presumed guilty unless you manage to prove yourself innocent. Anyone who's dealt with the IRS knows that the process is its own punishment. Now that tax forms are filed electronically, artificial intelligence and data mining increase the power to detect non-compliance exponentially. So when you hear that, there's less budget for auditors, they're using electronic means, right? Artificial intelligence, data mining, etc., to really do the work of what they used to use labor for. So by the way, those of you who say what we need is more jobs, you should be pretty mad at the government because they're getting rid of jobs. That was sarcastic. You've seen it firsthand. The law is truly unknowable to the governed. Being a law-abiding citizen is a myth. And again, most people are undeterred. Obviously, most people aren't listening to what I have to say. But again, I've had discussions, and people are just undeterred by that. The law is truly unknowable to the governed. Being a law-abiding citizen, it's a myth. People say, it's not perfect, Tom. Okay. Of course, this is just federal law. Any adult can be prosecuted for a federal crime, but what about state crimes? State law is another incomprehensible morass. Tens of thousands of pages of legalese per state. Cross an invisible line, and the same act may no longer be a crime, or it may have twice the penalty. Wade into California's legal code for a sample, or look up your own state and see for yourself. The abyss goes even deeper. There are thousands of county and municipal laws, too. Think about that. At some point, does anybody listening go, yeah, that's not a little bit unreasonable? That's absolutely, completely unreasonable. Again, ignorance of the law is no excuse. Next section in the article, Catch-22 is the title. This demonstration wasn't meant to depress you. Truth just sucks sometimes. In this case, ignorance is anything but bliss. Every single day, ignorance of the law costs people their savings and their freedom. And here's the awful catch, 22. Ignorance of the law is no defense, even though it's literally impossible to comprehend what the government demands from us. Good people everywhere have been turned into peaceful outlaws by politicians. Right? There's no alternative. We live our lives, remember he's talking about a noose around your neck? We live our lives trapped in a ubiquitous but invisible scaffolding of rules. There is literally no aspect of our lives not subject to politicians' orders. Everything that's not forbidden requires government permission. Think about that. What kind of society is this? I mean, the laws of the land have been supported in arguments against me on a moral basis, which I can't comprehend. It's just beyond me. Next section is crime detection is the killer app. As criminals, we already have a noose around our necks. Crime detection is the terrorizing question that hangs over us. That millions of Americans are behind bars, making one thing clear. The government is zealous about enforcement. New prisons are being built every day. Prosecution isn't a constraint either, since only a handful of cases see a trial. We talked about that last week, obviously. Crime detection is law enforcement's biggest bottleneck, and that's where collected-all surveillance changes everything. Police already track you by auto-scanning license plates and drones, but that is primitive compared to what's coming. This is so interesting, the stuff that's going on. Computerized face recognition is already extremely accurate and fast. Oops, I just lost my spot. You can be matched against a nationwide database instantly. This technology will be integrated with the body cameras police now wear. You will be cataloged and tracked by your UCN, Universal Control Number. Yes, that's really what it's called. A friend of mine is an Auschwitz survivor, the author writes. you can still read the control number tattooed on his arm. Again, it can't happen here. I've been told that so many times, like, make your head spin. Military contractor Lockheed Martin has for years been designing biometric surveillance systems to track us by our handprints, face, voice, and walking gait, right, your style. Their use for crime detection is unlimited. Anything that can be electronically measured can be the basis for automated crime detection. For example, fingerprints can now reveal drug use. Going forward, mass surveillance will be combined with robotics to create law enforcers who will automatically scan and crime check you. The military-industrial complex is leading robotics development. As with bug-sized drones and MRAPs, and I can't recall exactly what MRAPs are again. The technology and equipment will cross-pollinate with domestic law enforcement. And again, people say, well, wait a minute, that's military. You're saying, haven't we been talking about the militarization of the police in the last how many months? Haven't we seen the effects of what's going on? Haven't you seen that these military vehicles, these excess military vehicles, are now being used by the police? Right? And again, people say, no, that won't happen. Hopefully this glimpse of what's coming makes it clear. Mass surveillance isn't about having nothing to hide. It's about hiding whatever we can. And again, that's where he goes in this article about 10 steps you need to take. The next section is entitled Mass Surveillance Cheerleaders. The highest profile shills for mass surveillance are the usual suspects, politicians, and mega corporation execs who have the most to gain. Former U.S. Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott, this was his thing. What are people worried about? What is the problem? Are you doing something you're not supposed to? Right? Google chief hypocrite Eric Schmidt defines privacy as an excuse to hide wrongdoing. If you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. Well, Mr. Schmidt, what about your banking numbers? Right? What about your bank balances? What about your earnings? What about any of your innermost thoughts? Maybe you shouldn't have them if you don't want people to know them. Otherwise, you would have shared them with everyone. I mean, it's the absurdity of some of these comments. Google employs many brilliant people who no doubt mean well. But the simple truth is, Google's business is literally mass surveillance. Snowden revealed the NSA has direct access to Google's servers. Google's vast offering of services equals the world's biggest surveillance roach motel. There's a reason the room and board are free. You're the product, not the customer. Think about Facebook. Think about the information that can be gathered from you by your Google searches, from your emails, from your text messages, from your voice messages, from your voice conversations that are over the phone, right? Next section is until, again, this thing bobs down. The Death Star is in Utah. Of course, I like that because I'm a Star Wars fan. Those of you who have never watched or heard of Star Wars, which I don't know where you've been living, but those of you who haven't, you won't get that. Mass surveillance is not only collected all recording of your life. The totalitarian power of mass surveillance comes into focus when one sees how years of data can be summoned in the future for purposes you can't predict. 5 or 10 years from now, your surveillance record could be used as the basis for advanced interrogation, criminal prosecution, bail-ins, property confiscation, blackmail, stalking, humiliation, horrific medical procedures, internment camp, deportation, and yes, even execution. None of these are without historical precedent, right? Think of the internment of the Japanese, right? And again, people say, it can't happen here. And if I mention that, they go, well, that's in history. Hey, everything that's not happening now is in history. Hello, that's no great revelation. I mean, I cannot believe the things that people say to me in our conversations. The technology enabling collected all surveillance perhaps seems vague, since we don't have any practical reference for what it takes to implement. Here's a glimpse. Snowden's revelation of the collected all blueprint was the prelude to the completion of a $1.5 million, not $1.5 million, 1.5 million square foot complex called the Utah Data Center. The original name of the complex, Massive Data Repository, is more ominously instructive. I would hope that most people have heard about that giant building in Utah. Imagine a stadium-sized complex filled with the world's fastest supercomputers and endless racks of digital storage space, so vast that you literally can't comprehend how much information can be stored. The power and cooling required for the complex is staggering. It consumes 1.7 million gallons of water daily to operate. Isn't Utah a low water accessible area? Okay, just for you people who are big environmentalists who support the state, I assume then you support the use of 1.7 million gallons of water daily to operate this facility. This is the mass surveillance equivalent of the Death Star. Last year it went fully operational. It wasn't even fully operational in Star Wars. Consider this in light of Anne Frank. In the pre-digital time of the Nazis, they had a minuscule quantity of information about the Frank family compared to what would be known today. And the little information they had was stuffed in filing cabinets. The difference between filing cabinets and the space-age technology of the Utah data center is almost impossible to describe. Obviously, you can't even describe how much storage space. We got to describe it and how much water is used there to cool the thing in a day. In terms of speed, it's like comparing a tricycle with a supersonic jet. In terms of search power, it's like a magnifying glass versus the Hubble telescope. In terms of data storage, it's like a hot tub versus Lake Michigan. And yet it's worse. Next section is weaponized data mining. I hope you guys are finding some interest in this. I find this insanely interesting and revealing, of course. But obviously that's for each person to decide on their own. There is simply no comparison to be made in the pre-digital era when it comes to data mining, using the power of computers to find patterns across vast quantities of data. The Utah Data Center is weaponized data mining. Some of these terms you use are pretty good, actually. Collected all surveillance means that if the government wants to target you, it can comb back through years of your life in minute detail. As we'll see shortly, coming up with a crime in order to prosecute you is easy. Think about that. And again, I know many people are completely undeterred because it hasn't yet happened to them. Therefore, they believe it doesn't happen. Or if it does, it's not a big deal because those people deserved it, right? But let me reread that. As we'll see shortly, coming up with a crime in order to prosecute you is easy. How people are undeterred at that, I don't quite understand. There are so many laws in existence today that legal experts agree that anybody can be prosecuted for crimes they aren't aware they've committed. Even if you didn't commit the crime you're being prosecuted for, mass surveillance guarantees that innocence will be targeted because data mining can't tell whether a pattern is intentional or coincidental. Say there's an enemy of the government being tracked by the feds. You coincidentally are on the same flight sitting next to him. Use the same car service, stay in an adjacent room at the same hotel, eat at the same restaurant, and then take the same flight the next day to another city. Now you too are a target. If you happen to be a Muslim, good luck. Again, these are the words of the author. These aren't my words. Well, some of them are. U.S. law is clear on what might happen next. Perhaps men show up and interrogate you, or they secretly tear apart your life down to the smallest detail, looking for any charge to pin on you. Maybe they destroy your reputation and monitor how you respond, or maybe you get disappeared. Under the NDAA, American citizens can legally be kidnapped, imprisoned in secret without charges or access to a lawyer, indefinite detention, and subjected to torture programs developed by doctors. Think about it. They hire experts to come up with these torture programs. It's crazy. And by the way, you support that with your tax dollars, and I'm sure you're all good with that. To design the U.S. government's torture program, taxpayers paid over $81 million. Let me read that again. To design the U.S. government's torture program, taxpayers paid over $81 million to Dr. James Mitchell and Dr. Bruce Jessen, and another $31 million to Dr. Martin Seligman, former president of the American Psychological Association. Seligman is a man who achieved fame by repeatedly shocking dogs until they completely gave up trying to avoid the shock, even when presented with the opportunity to do so. The state of hopeless surrender is what he coined learned helplessness. These three were not paid $112 million to suggest sleep deprivation or waterboarding, both of which have been used for centuries. The public has no clue what the real torture program is. But given the government's history of using drugs to torment people, I suspect drugs are the holy grail of modern torture, as they break no bones and leave no scars. Imagine being inflicted with a drug-induced migraine and then getting locked in a cell with blasting heavy metal and flashing strobe lights. What would you say to make it stop? Centuries ago, you'd confess to being a witch. And I think I'm going to let the program go there. The next section is entitled Death from the Sky. But I think that's enough of my, I guess it turns out to be my crazy monologue. But I just want to leave it there, and we'll resume next time. But before I go tonight, I want to get to some of my conclusions for the day, so you're a little familiar with where we're going. I'm just scrolling down here. There's a whole lot more to this, actually. Again, I find it very interesting and very enlightening, and I think everyone should know, and I think we're not taught this. Again, he gets to the James Clapper thing and all other stuff, but I just wanted to say, the questions I laid out at the beginning of the show tonight, what do you do in the event the state requires you to do something that you're convinced is immoral? But think of this. What if you determine that the state's very existence is immoral? Obviously, that's where I am. What do you do now? You'll be an outcast. Okay? And just to add a little... which one I want to do here? Oh. If you're an outcast... I just watched the Lone Ranger movie recently, and maybe this is going to be a little hard to hear. Hopefully not, but here's a very short clip. Here's what the guy who becomes the Lone Ranger has to say about if the law is immoral, right? Okay, here we go. Listen closely.
If these men represent the law, I'd rather be an outlaw.
He says, if these men represent the law, I'd rather be an outlaw. Right? And that's where this puts you. Right? And, here's another famous one. I lined up a couple just so we could have a little fun here tonight. This is from, did I say, the other one was from The Lone Ranger. That was actually a very good movie. Again, that's a libertarian movie in my view. Another good libertarian movie was Robin Hood, the one with Russell Crowe. And this is really what the state has to say about you. If you think what the state wants is immoral, right, and you want to live honestly, this is what happens to you.
For the crimes of incitement to cause unrest, I declare him to be an outlaw! Oh, shall...
Right? You're an outlaw. So I think that's how people see Snowden. I think most people do. But think about what he's done. When I say, civil disobedience or peaceful resistance, it's a strategy to maintain and regain liberties lost. I advocate civil disobedience with no violent intent. To do so would violate the libertarian legal theory regarding the initiation of force. We never support the initiation of force on this show. This show, in our view, is to promote a just, peaceful, and prosperous world. And I just invite you to think of a couple things here before I call it a day and let you go. Is in fact Edward Snowden a traitor? Really think about that. Give that some serious thought. Think about Anne Frank, right? Was she guilty of violating another's property right? Think again of the horror she endured as many men obediently followed the immoral orders of the state. Civil disobedience is the only course for those who intend on, in Lysander Spooner's words, living honestly. Right? So with that, I'm going to close out the show tonight. Please tell your friends, heck, even tell your enemies about our show if you have any interest. I'm hoping Brad will be back with me next Tuesday. Next episode is again Tuesday, that June 23rd at 7 Central. I hope I provoked you to think a little bit tonight. I apologize that I'm all alone. I do like the dialogue better if I can get it, but not tonight. Make your comments on the Facebook page. Again, thanks to Cassie and Tanya and Tim. They do a great job of putting stuff on there. Very interesting stuff. Keep engaged. Provide your comments there. Ask your questions there. That's what that page is for. Thanks for listening. We look forward to our next discussion. I'm going to get us set up here so I can get us out of here with some musical accompaniment, as it were. Thanks for listening. We look forward to our next discussion. Till next time, this has been the Annoying Peasant Radio Show, and I'm going to leave you tonight with Mac DeMarco, Salad Days. Good night, everybody, and thanks again for listening.
As I'm getting older, chip upon my shoulder, rolling through life, you roll over and die. La 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 la, la 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 la, la 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 la. Missing you, John, sad days are gone, remembering things, just tell them so long. Acting like my life's already over. Dear, act your age and try another year. Always feeling tired, smiling when you're quiet. Write another year off and kinda resign. Salad days are gone, missing hippie John. Remember the days, just tell them so long. Acting like my life's already over. Try another year. Mama, acting like my life's already over.